Millions of immigrants arrived in the United States between 1880 and 1920. Immigrant labor made possible the rapid industrial growth of the Northeast. Women and children took jobs in factories and mills. Urbanization created dramatic changes in family life. To address the social problems which came with these changes, many women's organizations developed. The long struggle for women's suffrage achieved victory with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Nearly half of the people now living in the United States are descended from those who immigrated here from Europe between 1880 and 1920. During those 40 years, more than 20 million people left behind their homelands and often their families. They braved the dangerous crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to build a better life in America. Most of the people who emigrated from Europe were from small, rural villages. They came to America with few possessions, often only what they could carry. Most didn't have enough money to buy land for farms. Instead, they crowded into urban areas, transforming towns like Milwaukee, Detroit, and Buffalo into large cities, and cities like Boston, New York, and Chicago into huge urban centers. In New York and other cities, a variety of ethnic neighborhoods developed. Good housing was scarce and expensive. Immigrant families crowded into dilapidated apartment buildings, often without bathrooms or running water. Large families were packed into 2 or 3 rooms. Every available inch of space was used for sleeping at night and working during the day. Women who were used to raising small animals and growing vegetables in their own gardens now had to buy all their food in markets or from street vendors. Instead of cooking over open fires, they now did their cooking indoors on coal stoves. Immigrant women established organizations and institutions to maintain their cultural identity and traditions. At school, though, their children learned to speak English and to blend into the new American culture. Children of immigrant families often felt conflicted between their desire to become Americanized and their sense of cultural pride, tradition, and family loyalty. People in urban environments needed cash, so they worked for even the most meager wages. Children, as well as adults, took jobs in industries like clothing and cigar manufacturing. Women with children often worked at home and were paid according to the number of pieces they finished. Their children's work was needed too. Whole families worked 12 to 14 hours a day at home, sewing or making small items. In order to bring in more cash, many women provided meals for single men or took in boarders. By 1880, over 4 million women, 1 out of every 7, worked for pay outside their homes. The majority were young, unmarried immigrants who worked as servants or in manufacturing. They typically labored between 60 and 80 hours a week, often under noisy, crowded, and dangerous conditions. A Bureau of Labor report said this:
employees were packed like sardines in a box, without ventilation of any kind. Women who worked with dust-laden materials were prone to lung and bronchial diseases.
In 1909, a major strike brought the plight of these industrial workers to public awareness. In New York City's garment industry, over 100 workers were fired for joining a union. They responded by picketing the factory, demanding the right to organize. Then, after a week of harassment and arrests, they asked for support from the Women's Trade Union League, a group of primarily middle-class women who were concerned about the situation of working women. On November 22, 1909, a mass meeting was held to consider extending the strike to all of the city's shirtwaist manufacturing shops. After many long speeches by male union leaders, a young woman named Clara Lemlich stood up and spoke from the floor.
I am a working girl, one of those on strike against intolerable conditions. I'm tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What we are here for is to decide whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now.
The crowd roared. Her motion to strike received thunderous endorsement. The next day, nearly 30,000 women from over 300 shops walked off their jobs. The strikers were assaulted by strikebreakers, beaten by police, and 600 were arrested. This strike, called the Uprising of the 20,000, demonstrated the powerful potential of labor organizing among women. When the strike ended 13 weeks later, 312 shops had union contracts. One shop that refused to sign a contract or improve working conditions was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Women there continued to work in overcrowded conditions, the air clouded with highly flammable lint. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out. It spread quickly to the 9th and 10th floors of the factory. Hundreds of women were trapped in the inferno. The building's only fire escape collapsed as the young women tried desperately to escape. Some died as their falling bodies hit the pavement or were impaled on the iron fences in front of the factory. In all, 146 women died awful deaths in full view of their families, neighbors, and friends. The public outcry that followed the Triangle Fire and the uprising of the 20,000 did eventually lead to changes in New York factories. City factories weren't the only places with dreadful working conditions and low wages. Rural areas had mill towns and mining camps where entire families worked 6 days a week and could still barely afford the cost of rent and other necessities. Child labor became commonplace. The misfortune of these young children became a major concern of women social reformers. Mary Harris Jones became a roving labor agitator and fearless strike leader at the age of 50. Known as Mother Jones, this now legendary Irish-born woman worked tirelessly to bring the tragedy of mine workers and child labor to the attention of public and government leaders. Mexican women and their families continued immigrating into the Southwest. 1/8 of Mexico's population moved north, fleeing the political and economic chaos generated by the Mexican Revolution of 1911. These newcomers reinforced Mexican culture and tradition in the barrios. Like the Mexican Americans already living there, the newcomers also faced economic and social discrimination. And, like immigrants on the East Coast, their single daughters often worked in factories, particularly in food processing and garment plants. In rural areas, these women often had little choice but to work as servants or as farm workers. By 1890, a variety of new professions were opening up for native-born white women. The invention of the typewriter revolutionized American business. Thousands of secretarial and clerical positions were created and filled by women. More than 75,000 female office workers were employed in a field that had previously been reserved exclusively for men. Women also moved into new positions as telephone operators, and retail stores hired large numbers of women as sales clerks. Teaching and nursing also became clearly defined as women's occupations. This was the beginning of the sex-segregated, service-oriented female labor force, which is still in existence today. Nearly 1 million black women were in the paid labor force at the turn of the century. They were concentrated in southern agricultural jobs and in domestic and other service jobs like commercial laundries. The greater availability of jobs encouraged thousands to move to northern cities. There, domestic jobs were easy to find. By 1900, middle-class homemakers were able to buy mass-produced items rather than make the things their families needed themselves. Factories manufactured everything, from clothing to toasters to washing machines. Domestic tasks were much easier for those who could afford the modern conveniences: hot and cold running water, sewing machines, and natural gas for cooking. Middle-class women, then, had more time to involve themselves outside their homes. Their daughters pursued higher education and careers in increasing numbers. Many chose to live away from their parents, either alone or with friends, the first generation able to do so. Jane Addams exemplified this new woman. She and her close friend, Ellen Gates Starr, established a settlement house in a Chicago immigrant neighborhood. Called Hull House, it became a community center where other educated women lived and worked to improve conditions for the poor. They taught classes there in English, health, and nutrition. They scheduled social activities and provided child care for working mothers. The Hull House program was so successful that it soon inspired hundreds of other settlement houses throughout the country. Jane Addams' effort to help the poor made her one of the most admired women in the country. Black women, like Mary Church Terrell and Anna J. Cooper, were also active in settlement houses established to benefit poor blacks. For generations, women had been defined exclusively as keepers of home and family. Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, hit upon a clever tactic for expanding this definition to include civic involvement. Under the banner of home protection, she organized hundreds of thousands of women to address a variety of family-related issues. In addition to fighting alcohol abuse, the WCTU worked for reforms in child labor laws, health protections for working women, child care, and women's suffrage. They declared the ballot and legislative programs as necessary weapons for home protection. By these tactics, they avoided the criticisms that previous women activists had faced for stepping outside of traditional roles. Women's organizations became very important at this time. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, established in 1892, had a membership of more than 1 million white women. Under the leadership of Mary Church Terrell, the National Association of Colored Women was formed in 1896 and had a membership of 50,000 within 9 years. Most women's organizations reflected the racial prejudice of the society around them by requiring racially separate chapters. Black and white groups worked in their own communities on issues such as improved educational opportunities, child care, public health, temperance, and women's suffrage. By the time Reconstruction ended in 1877, racial segregation had become a way of life in the South. Violence against blacks was used to enforce this separation. In a speech in 1909, black journalist Ida B. Wells documented over 3,000 lynchings of black women and men which had occurred in the previous 20 years. Her report generated a brutal backlash. White vigilantes set fire to her newspaper office and threatened her life. Her brave efforts led to an anti-lynching campaign which united blacks and sympathetic whites nationwide. In 1890, the two largest suffrage organizations joined forces to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But suffragists achieved only a few victories. In 1910, however, new leadership began to bring the movement back to life. American suffragist leaders were inspired by the growing militancy of the British suffrage movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, formed the Women's Political Union, which organized massive demonstrations in New York City, generating new public enthusiasm for the cause. Another huge suffrage parade was held in Washington, D.C., the day before President Wilson's inauguration. 5,000 women marched, with over 20,000 spectators looking on. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, provided the brilliant strategies and effective leadership that eventually brought the movement to victory. Alice Paul, an outspoken activist, was determined to increase pressure on Congress for a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution. In 1916, she helped form the National Women's Party, which campaigned against President Wilson and other Democrats who had refused to support women's suffrage. The Women's Party is best known for its campaign of daily silent picketing in front of the White House. Their signs expressed their sentiments for President Wilson and all the world to see. At first, Wilson and the police treated the pickets politely, but when the United States became actively involved in World War I, the public turned against the demonstrators for criticizing the president. People started fights with the pickets, who were then arrested by the police. Many of the jailed women went on hunger strikes to protest this injustice. Their jailers resorted to brutal force feeding to keep them alive. The public was thoroughly outraged at this inhumane treatment. General opinion grew stronger and stronger in favor of the demonstrators and the suffrage cause. Suffragists throughout the country celebrated when the 19th Amendment was finally passed.